Alrighty, well, thanks everybody for tuning into this episode of Greater Than 0%. Today we have Nate Pietrini, who's the Executive Director of High Jump. Nate, thank you so much for your time today.
Joseph, it's a pleasure to be here. How are you?
Doing good, doing excited for this one. But let's definitely get into it. As usual, we like to start by just getting the elevator pitch, the mission statement from, in this case, the Executive Director. So, Nate, what is the mission of High Jump?
So, the mission of High Jump is to prepare academically motivated students from limited economic means to thrive in high school. And we do that through academic enrichment, social emotional learning, and supporting them and their families as they navigate a really complicated high school landscape. And if I had about 15 more seconds in the elevator, I would tell people, one of the most important times in your entire life is what we call early adolescence or the middle grades. It's the second most important time for brain development. And so utilizing the sort of ages 12 through 15 where high jump sits, we take that time to have really positive experiences that are enriching in both academics and social emotional learning, things that students wouldn't otherwise have access to due to family resources. So high jump really sets them up to get the most out of that time so that they thrive in high school and ultimately go on to graduate college and earn a family sustaining wage.
All right. I have tons of questions, but before we do, Nate, why you? You
Yeah.
know, you've been the executive director now, what,
Why
6 or 7
me?
years? So,
Yeah, it'll be 7 years this fall, Joseph. I've spent 20 years in education, and the question of why you, for me, I think sort of lies at this intersection between like practical thinking and being mission driven. I got into education partly because I didn't know what else there was to do. I wasn't an incredibly driven college student, nor was I someone who you would say, boy, that kid, as young as he was, he knew what he wanted. It just wasn't me. It took me a while to figure things out. And I experimented around, tried a few classes in college. And the only thing that I really enjoyed was an intro to education class where we were required, first class I ever took in education, to spend about 4 hours a week at a local middle school. And I would show up, no clue what I'm getting into. And this teacher would take me and be like, you go deal with that kid. And it was normally this kid who just was the one kid who couldn't keep up on either academics or behavior. And I would sit with the kid and I didn't know what I was doing. So I would
no.
start small talk around things like, oh, you're wearing an Indiana Pacers jersey. Do you like the Pacers? And then we'd start off talking basketball. And then eventually we'd get into the math worksheet. And I enjoyed those experiences. And so I took another class and took another class. And next thing I know, I'm teaching middle school in Rockledge, Florida, feeling like I'm part of like the wild, wild west where this job of teaching, you got so little, at least I did, so little one-on-one coaching and feedback and instruction. And I would just get thrown into these crazy situations and I have to figure it out. And I realized this pattern of like, when I spent some very real time thinking about what I want my kids to know and be able to do, how to connect with them as humans, when I spend some real intentional time thinking about how my classroom is or is not inclusive and welcoming and warm, when I would do all those things, the kids would thrive. They would learn more, they would challenge me. And so I went through this period of always just kind of like falling forward a little bit, and ultimately, I had a really great boss. I had the ability to be part of starting a high school on the south side of Chicago, and I had a really great boss who was sort of intentional with me now about making me fall forward. Is I would chit chat with her in the hall and say, I'm getting really frustrated. Nobody comes on time to my first period class, and she'd say, "Well, why is that?" And I'd be like, "Well, I don't know." And she'd be like, "Find out, solve it for your class and come back to me." And so I would figure it out. I'd stand at the front door and instead of like, wagging my finger at a kid, I'd say things like, well, why were you late? And they talk about a missed bus, or I had to get my little sister ready for school and drop her off at school, or I don't have an alarm clock. And I'd hear all these things. Then I'd go back to her and tell her the things that I would heard. And she'd say, now, what are you going to do about it? And then I would try and solve it. And then she'd say, great, now solve it for the whole school, right? And so I would implement these intervention systems, and she kept coaching me in that way. And then I started realizing, like, okay, if I could be impactful for my kids in this one thing, and then impactful for the whole school in that same thing, what if I could do all those things for every teacher and every kid in the whole school? And that's what sort of led me into school administration, of this idea that maybe I was good at pretty intuitively and pretty quickly figuring out how to solve a problem in a school and working the whole school through it. I was fortunate enough to have some similar experiences when I became a principal, people who believed in me and pushed me forward and asked the right questions. So I got people motivated to improve and schools to improve. And I love being an elementary school principal. That was the last job that I had before high jump. A certain sense of like, uh, I don't know, helping you're one day you're helping 5-year-olds blow their noses and they're crying, and you're just getting them to feel loved and seen, and you're helping eighth graders deal with social and emotional challenges and conflicts and high school application processes, and loved that job and every part of it. But to come back to your question, Joseph, of why me for this job, high jump, a lot of it on the practical side revolves around that question of like, what opportunities are there for educators to make an impact that are outside of schools? And I
Mm.
had worked so far with blinders on for 15 years of my education career that I was like, I learned how to be a really good teacher and realized I could increase my impact by being a really good assistant principal. And then I think I learned how to do that and realized I could have increased my impact by being a really good principal. And then, was like, well, what do I do after that? I have no
Yeah.
idea. And I called a few friends and said, if I can't be a principal for 30 more years, what else can I be? Because I don't know how to look outside of this sort of very clear step-by-step education process. And they were like, well, I don't know what to tell you, but I do know that the world is a lot bigger than you probably think. And there's probably a lot more organizations that would take you. You just need to figure out what's on your non-negotiable lists. And so
Yeah.
this really wise person sort of sent me around to do a bunch of informational interviews, not to even necessarily like learn about other jobs, but to try and learn more about myself and to have the people I was meeting, this is really good advice, tell me at the end of a conversation what they think I would be good at and why, and whether or not they could see me in their job. And sort of at the end of these kind of like walkabouts, I realized like, I love education. I want to stay in education. There's this whole civic sector, at least here in Chicago, where there's hundreds of really awesome nonprofits that are doing direct service on behalf of kids, and they need good leaders and good teachers and good people. And it would make a whole lot of sense for me to kind of work in that space if I wanted and I was qualified. There's a deep sense of like insecurity, like who wants a principal to do that thing? It's so different. I couldn't possibly do it. But to know that that world exists, I could do it. But then I had so that was like the missional piece was like, I can do it and I can love and serve in that space. But then on a real practical side as well, I needed to figure out what I wanted.
Yeah.
And everything that I wanted lined up great with high jump was that I wanted to be at like a justice and equity and opportunity focused organization. And high jump was that space that I've been doing that for 35 years. And I got fortunate enough that when I was ready to think about what was next, high jump was looking for an executive director.
Wow.
And it was education focused, it's opportunity focused, and on that sort of like practical, where does that washed up principle go from here? High jump was like, maybe this place, right?
Wow. As you're talking about your career progression, you mentioned opportunity to increase impact, and it sounds like you had a non-negotiable list. I'd imagine that changing roles from a principal to an executive director being pretty drastic, where you might not
Yeah,
be like you're not obviously you're not in this deep as deep in the school system.
for sure.
Maybe
For
that's an
sure.
assumption. Maybe the day to day is very different, where you're not maybe interacting as much as you have in the past with the students. Again, it could be right,
Mm-hmm.
could be wrong, but
No, you're right.
are you have you just when you run into that feeling like, oh, I wish I would have, been able to be more hands-on with some people, or you try to just tell yourself, well, I'm having a bigger impact in this current role, so stop thinking that way. Just keep on keeping on.
Yeah, that's part of it. It is still hard for me sometimes, and I try to just get smaller wins and smaller engagements where I can when I need that sort of like student piece and student perspective.
Yeah.
I'll give you a really quick example. Um, right now, High Jump is going through the admissions process for our 36th cohort, and we have thousands of alumni we've served over the years who are college, career, and they come back and they interview students to get into our program. And actually, about 45 high school and college students are on staff at High Jump. And so, those students who have completed the program, I still consider them like students of our program, even though those 45 work for us. I just look for opportunities to serve like them if I can.
Yep.
So just last week, one of them who's a sophomore here at the University of Chicago is trying to find an internship for this summer. And so for me, I'm like, I'm going to find this kid an internship because I know people, right? So I'm working with her to try and help her do that. It's not really part of my normal job description. Most people don't know I do it. But A, that helps that kid, and B, it helps give me that student connection. Because when I was a principal, Joseph, man, it was wild. If I was doing any strategic planning, it was at 10 o'clock at night or 6 o'clock in the morning, because from 7:30 to 4:30, I was running full speed. Everything I was doing was, you got 5 minutes to solve this problem, and then you're on to the next one. Or it was teacher evaluation, or it was student responses, student services, student supports. I didn't get to sit down with a whiteboard. I didn't get to pull together 4 to 5 teachers who I wanted to meet with and talk about a problem, and make sure that they understand it correctly and then let them go. It was really hard to find time and places to do that. And so it didn't happen as much. It was a lot of just kind of day to day, which brought me in close contact with students, in close contact with teachers. And that just doesn't really happen that much anymore. So that's hard. But on the other side, too, I'm also trying to think positively about the personal development of myself. Anytime you kind of change industries, you got to think about what you'll gain, what skills that you'll gain as a worker, as a person who tries to be the best that they can in their role. And so for me, that was on things like fundraising. But the only fundraising I ever really did was like, I would participate in the school walkathon, or I would give a rousing speech at the gala, or the fundraising events. But I didn't have to like develop the fundraising strategy, not to ask for money. There's a whole nother business side when you're part of Chicago Public Schools, as I was. There's like 45,000 employees. So I don't have any say over things like software, over accounting procedures. And it's also like, you get your $5 million budget as a principal, which sounds like a lot, but then like 4.8 million of it goes towards staff salaries and benefits. And so then you're like, okay, I can spend $200,000 on textbooks right now, and now we have no money left for the rest of the year. And that was sort of the way that you budgeted. Whereas in nonprofit, you're sort of, everything's kind of the reverse. You're envisioning a future, which I'm sure you and I will talk about in a little bit, like when we talk about High Jump. You're envisioning a future, and then you've got to find a way to get to it, as opposed to when you're in schools. It's unfortunately a little bit backwards. It's like, here's your finite resources, and you're just going to try to control things across about the next 40 weeks. Go, and then you kind of start over again. Yep. So really, really different. And I've just tried to lean into like what I'm learning, and get better at kind of the business side of the job.
Yeah. Well, I know we want to talk very briefly about the history. So 1989, y'all are not a new organization. So I'd love to hear some of the origins and how it's evolved to today.
Thanks. We're pretty established here in Chicago, and I'm fortunate to be the person who gets to steward us during this era. But long time ago, there's this very talented woman who's still around and still gives me great advice. who founded this program. And her challenge and her concern was, so the city of Chicago has a whole long history of students not attending their neighborhood high schools.
Mm.
Really, it was really odd to me growing up. It's like, you go to that school right there. Everybody does. Um, but there's a long history of that not happening in Chicago public schools. Right now, it's almost 80% of eighth graders do not go to their neighborhood school. And this woman was an assistant principal at a private school, and she was noticing that a large portion of students who were new at this K to 12 school were coming in at ninth grade and were leaving. And we're not saying, regardless of academic performance, especially if
Mm.
it were low income children, especially if it was children of color. This was a predominantly white institution. And she would talk to these students and they'd say things like, I was a really high performer at my prior school, but I never took algebra or I never took lab sciences. And then I came here and a lot of my peers had taken algebra, they had taken lab sciences. I scored in the top first percentile of the state on the standardized exams, but all these other kids are a full year ahead of me in content exposure. Or
Mm.
there's some class and race issues, and I, this place is not being welcoming. It's not inclusive to me. And
Mm.
so she took it upon herself to try and A, change the environment to be more welcoming and inclusive, and B, work to support students in middle school. And she created High Jump, this idea of let's recruit 16 students, was what she started with, and let's run a really intensive summer and weekend program for them across 2 years. Like, summer before seventh grade will start, we'll go all the way through eighth grade, and we will set these young people up to thrive in high school, whether they come to my school that she was working at that time or go elsewhere. We want to make sure that if you love learning and you love science and you love reading and you love debates, or you want to love those things, that you get free out of school time programming, free enrichments, so that you, when you show up to high school, you're on that solid footing. And she started that program, and we have largely retained that same structure and been around for 36 years, where young people join our program the summer before seventh grade. They do 5 full weeks of programming all summer. Then they come every other Saturday during the school year, and they do it again for a second year. And we're making sure they take 2 years of algebra, 2 years of lab science, humanities courses, various electives in a warm, encouraging, safe environment. They have alumni who completed the program years before them, working in their classroom, near peer mentor roles those young people fill. We work to support their parents to help them navigate this complicated high school application process, where if you say you don't speak English, let's say you're a single parent, let's say you just don't have time to learn and navigate the ins and outs of this complicated Chicago high school process, High Jump's here to support you. And this wonderful woman who founded us in 1989, she had hoped to just be able to do this for 15 or 16 kids every year. This year, we're serving 265 new
Jeez.
rising seventh graders, and I hope is to grow every single year. And you and I had a little bit of a chat earlier about the importance of nonprofits, not only doing good work. I mean, you can walk in our classrooms and be blown away by the good work, but knowing and communicating the impact of what they
Mm.
do, right? Well, the impact of what we do, and studies that we have done show that for every 1 year a young person is in high jump, they make 2 years worth of gains on standardized exams. Students like ours graduate college at a rate of about 41% nationally. That's what we call the academically motivated but low income students, about 41%. High jump students graduate at a rate of 87%. And our alumni
Jeez.
go on to, like, supporting wonderful organizations and companies. About 15% of our board members are alumni. They did the program 20 years ago, and they're back supporting High Jump. One of our board members just got recognized for the work that she did this last year in one of Chicago's neediest communities, developing a new community-free public health center. Our alums are energy leaders in Washington, D.C. on clean, renewable energy. Our board members are attorneys and doctors, and our teachers are people working on affordable housing. There are 3,000 people who have completed the high jump program over these last 35 years. And high jump helped them thrive in high school, graduate college, and raise up the next generation of leaders themselves. It's a really impactful program with some strong data stories behind it.
Yeah. Wow. Uh, like initial question. So from the initial
Yeah.
programming, it sounded like it was hyper simplified into two big reasons why, in the example of the
Yeah.
previous executive director, the kids weren't staying at that school. You said one was that they had a gap in academics that prevented them from just keeping up, and then
Yeah.
two is the inclusivity. So how are you currently, and how are you addressing
Yeah.
the, I guess let's start with the inclusivity component, because I feel like that's a little bit harder to control from a high
Yeah.
jump perspective
It
versus like,
is.
all right, we know that there's gaps in these specific academic subjects. Let's hone in on them. So
Yeah.
it sounds like that's something that could be a little bit more easily overcome with just the hardcore academic focus and
You're spot
and
on.
learning. Yeah.
Yeah, you're spot on, Joseph, right? We do, if you enroll in a high jump program, you're going to do about 600 hours of our programming. That's way more than you'll probably do of any sports team you're on. And so our young people are going to make huge gains. Uh, the type of environment that they go into in high school, as you heard me say, only about a little over 20% of these young people are going to go to their neighborhood high school. So we're talking 60, 80 different high schools. High Jump's a nonprofit. While we look and feel like a school, we're not a school. I'm not a superintendent. I can't make a high school be more inclusive, but there's two
Yeah.
things we can do. One is we can work to try to influence the field a little bit. I'll give you a quick example of that right now. We had a grant that was given to us, and we hired a researcher, and we are basically done with the research. Over the next year or so, we will roll out the findings in a couple of different ways, but we're going to publish some original research around how low-income students of color experience test like highly selective test-driven public schools. So there are a number of public schools here in Chicago that you have to test into. What is the experience there for students like ours, and how can those schools be more thoughtful about including and looking out for young people like ours? We know that when you add new knowledge to to schools and education, many people will take that to heart and will improve their schools. So we hope from like a research perspective, we can push them. We also, because our program has been around for a long time, there are high schools and boards of directors and collaboratives around the city that ask our team how they can make their spaces more inclusive. It's really hard for us to force them to be, as I said
Right.
earlier, but I think that there's a lot of things that people can really just do to set up their high school to make sure no matter what kind of a high school you are thoughtful of about what it takes for those young people to get there. And I would say there's really like three big things that I would remind high school principals out there, especially if you're trying to make your school welcoming and inclusive for academically motivated children of limited economic means, or really anybody is. And these are things people don't think about as much. Number one, what's it take for a young person to get there? If you travel long, if you travel on the bus, if you are walking and along, like how can they shorten that up? How can they help people and remind them that this is often one of the hardest things for young people who are attending a high school? It's not their own. The second one, eliminate all fees. There's this idea that public schools are free. They're not. Not everyone who qualifies for fee waivers takes those. We hear about young people going to public high schools and paying $600, $800 between student fees, sports fees. You got to eliminate those. And then one of the third ones, and I'm trying to focus here on the things that aren't as obvious, like diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives. And one of the third ones is like remembering the importance of out of school time programming. That's a place where young people get a lot of cultural and social capital they wouldn't otherwise, where they learn, take a class with that teacher, you're allowed to ask for extensions on classes. Young people learn a lot of that stuff actually while they're running for cross country practice or while they're hanging out in the newspaper lab. So get young people, especially people who may not appear to have as much social or cultural capital at your high school, get them involved in extracurriculars and make sure they stay.
Mm. Wow. So next question here. I feel like we've had the opportunity to interview a lot of different organizations and nonprofits, and the more I've realized that the more specific they are on where their swim lane is in their community of
Yeah.
people that they want to impact, the more impact that they can have. And it sounds like High Jump has a very specific target community, and it's academically motivated, 12 to 15 years old, limited economic means, and that's your
Yeah,
sweet spot. That's where blinders on, focus on this, impact this.
very
Can
much
you touch a
so.
little bit on why, in terms of just our development, our mental development at that age, but how, I'm trying to think of where I want to go with it. So that specific target, has that been what the organization set out in '89 and hasn't changed to
Yeah.
today? And have you ever considered changing that, or has that been has there been like pressure, like why don't you do this, everyone? Like it's an awesome it's an awesome program.
Yeah.
Like, so I'm wondering if there's been any
Um,
temptations to
yeah, I
divert from
mean,
that. Yeah.
sure. I mean, the answer is yes, all across the board. So we always were overwhelmingly focused on a 2-year investment period, um, ending in the second sixth grade ends and going all the way to basically to high school starting. We do have an alumni programs manager who provides optional support for high school aged alumni. So if you
Right.
finished high jump, which the vast majority of our young people do, over 80%, you can get like intervention programs where for those who feel like they're worried about success and want and call for help, we do intervention programs in the summer for them. We do at free SAT prep, free ACT prep, college counseling. We refer students to scholarships. And we do, as you heard me say earlier, youth employment work. We'll hire you
Right.
back, about 45 of them a year. I wish we could do a lot more of that, and I think that's still within our swim lane. Where we have maybe stepped a little bit outside of that is to try and address these questions of who should get academic enrichment outside of school time, right? And I would hope we all agree that every kid should. Academic enrichment is not just for kids who are performing in the top quartile in school,
Right.
right? Everybody should have an opportunity to find what they love in school or the arts or in STEM and pursue that. And High Jump would love to find a way to do that. We are right now piloting a program that's a little bit more inclusive, and who participates. The idea behind it is how do we remove all the barriers for access to our program? And we basically looked at all the reasons why someone might not do high jump, including they wouldn't make it through that application funnel, including geography, including the content that we teach. And we've designed this little mini program in partnership with Chicago Public Schools and Northwestern University, where we go into a community and we learn and we listen from the community, and we make the high jump model fit the needs and the desires of that community. And then we let the community refer young people to our
Right.
program,
Right.
and whoever they refer is whoever we take. And we program them for 2 years, and then we give them the optional high school support. So they are now a high jump student, because the vision that I have for high jump, if I'm still here in 35 years, if high jump's still here in 35 years, which we will be, is that every interested and eligible child for this program does this program, and that we continue to think a little bit more expansively about, how we make sure that definition of academically motivated doesn't really laser in too hard on something like test
Right. Right.
scores, or too hard on something like grades or teacher recommendations. And so having multiple programs is something that I want to encourage other nonprofits to think about, that serve kind of the same age range, but have the same end goal for the young people, and that's to thrive in high school and beyond. There's about 30,000 kids per grade in Chicago public schools. And so when I tell you we're going to enroll 265 or so this summer, that's huge. But man, Joseph, we've got a long way to go when we think about every interested kid,
Yeah, yeah,
and maybe in 35 years we'll be there.
yeah. That was my next question. Your current cohort size on average versus the total attainable, and you said 30,000 is the per
Yeah,
grade, which means
right.
if you're in that 2 year
Uh,
range, yeah. So every
yeah,
wow,
yeah, about
wow,
30,000. But obviously not every kid is going to want to do a really intensive out of school time academic
right,
enrichment
right.
program. Not every kid is going to want to do something not every kid can do it. So
Um,
we're trying to create different models, trying to think about how to continue to expand that. In my brain, I'd love to see us one day serving 10% of those
yeah,
students. I think that is a very fair uh, growth size for an
yeah.
organization like ours, doing what we do with that population. And we still have a very long way to go.
Yeah. Well, the last question I have before we talk about
Yeah.
engagement, and you mentioned this. You said that and going back to what I mentioned of you being very specific about the community that you're having an impact on, which is really impactful in and of itself to be able to have a focus. Is you said people that love learning certain topics or want to love learning certain topics.
Yeah.
How do you how do you decipher those two, and then how do you get the people that want to love into actual lovers of certain topics? I kind of love
that
that example you provided.
Yeah, that's a great example. So in our mind, want to love is more about you see it in sort of like the academic persistence or academic curiosity
Yeah,
in students. Because if those things are there, even in the slightest bit, you can help them love it. And I think they just don't know that they want to love it yet. So I'll give you a couple examples. Um, we're interviewing students right now, as I said, sixth graders to be a part of our program. And one of the questions we ask students is like, tell me about a time you failed at something and what'd you do? And then we ask a series of questions to try and understand that a little bit more. And the most common thing that we hear from these young people is a student will tell you who doesn't feel strong in math or doesn't like math or doesn't feel strong in science or doesn't like sciences will say, I failed this test or I failed a project
mm,
and I was crushed. I hear that from students all the time. It's the first F I ever got was in a sixth grade math test, and I didn't know what to do. But then they tell a story about, so then I'll say, so what did you do? And a lot of
mhm,
times that's where the story comes in of the young person saying, I asked my teacher for help, and this great teacher helped me. And you hear a story of a kid working with them at lunch or working with them after school, and eventually they persisted and they did great in math. That tells us, and that should tell that kid that they want to love math. And
yeah,
our job is to create a community where it's safe to fail and where we celebrate failure because it means you're going to now learn something and you're going to grow. And then the students learn to love the process, and then they learn to love learning across all subjects. And so that's one of the things that we tell students is we're trying to foster for you a love of learning, not a love of math, not a love of science, not a love of reading, a love of learning. And it's a journey. We're going to go on there together. And so it's often that we get students who apply to our program who either feel bored in their school or who just love learning, but they don't love it in all subjects.
right,
And we are
right.
not an intervention program. We are a enrichment program. So we've got to think about every single thing we do with our young people as being about fun, being engaging, and being about just cultivating and developing a love for that learning process.
Wow. Well, engagement. So people that are listening that want to get involved or
Yeah,
contribute,
let's talk
how
about
can
it.
they get involved? How can they get engaged? What type of engagement do you look for?
Yeah, so we have a couple of really wonderful volunteer opportunities every year, specifically that deals with helping our students in eighth grade get prepared for an interview process. If you live in Chicago and you're applying for high school, it's highly likely you're going to have to either perform or interview or write essays, do something live and real to get into that high school. So we've got a great opportunity every fall where you get to help those students do mock interviews, give them some feedback. We've got a great opportunity every spring where you help us interview over 350 young people for access into the program. We do career day, career exposure opportunities for our young people. Those are the three main ways in which people can volunteer. We have wonderful communications that come out from high jump. So if you go to our website, highjumpchicago.org, again, that's high jump, like the track event, highjumpchicago.org, and you scroll all the way to the bottom, you can sign up for our newsletter and you'll see awesome stories about high jump students, the success stories of our young people in college, working for high jump, becoming accomplished professionals. You'll get all those great news, and you'll get opportunity for volunteer events. And really, one of the most important ways that I just want to encourage people to remember and think about, you heard me say, Joseph, I had to learn to be a fundraiser. So like, here it comes. 100% of what we do is free. So we are spending around $7,000 per year per kid for this program, and it's
Wow.
all fundraised. It's all donated by individuals, and every dollar counts. You can sign up to give monthly. You can give one time. That's all on our website. And I believe that we all have a responsibility to invest back in young people because people invested in us. And so if you've made it somewhere on your educational journey, somebody helped you along the way. And I believe that personal charity and personal philanthropy is part of the responsibility of being an adult. So when you go to our website, folks, if to another student who can go on and do what you're doing one day and help our teachers support these wonderful young people. And if you're in Chicago and you ever want to come to an event for high jump, again, you can email us on our website. We'll let you know when we have community events, fundraising events, volunteer events. Just drop us an email and we'll get back to you right away.
Oh, so folks that are listening, all of the calls to actions have been mentioned. And if you guys want to help support high jump to almost, I think 10x is the big goal of getting 10%
That's
of
the
the
goal.
total. Yeah, 10xing the impact and the students that you guys are working with. So get engaged and look in the show notes here of the episode, and all the links should be provided. But Nate, is there anything you want to leave us with before we wrap up? I feel like we covered a lot, but just wanted to make sure that we captured everything. Yeah.
We did. It was a pleasure, Joseph. It was a great conversation with you. And thanks for giving us this platform to amplify high jump.
All right. Well, Nate, thank you so much. And we're honored to share your story and keep up the good work. And we wish you the best.
Thanks, buddy. See you soon. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.